Hi, my name is Kevin Yee, and I am the College and Young Adults Pastor at Church Every Day in Northridge, California.
Hello, my name is Danny Kwon. I'm Rooted's Senior Director of Youth Ministry Content and Cross-Cultural Initiatives. And before that, I was a youth pastor at a Korean American church for 29 years.
All right, so today we're here to talk about youth ministry. I believe, so I've been in youth ministry for 18 years, and I think you've been in ministry for double, triple, quadruple.
No. But I was at one church for 29 years as a youth pastor.
Yeah, so 18 at one church as a youth pastor. So that's a lot of years collectively. Yeah. And so the topic that we're going to be talking about today is about some of the things that people believe about youth ministry that we want to kind of deconstruct and kind of reconstruct something a little bit better. So first question, Danny, how can church leaders encourage the church to recognize that youth are not a department? Because oftentimes, actually most of the times, especially in the immigrant church context that we were in, the youth ministry is a department of the church. But how can we get the church to, even though that's probably a practical reality of how ministry has to work, how do we get the church and church leaders to see the youth not just as a department, but really as younger church members, essentially?
Yeah, and I say this gracefully that because of language, a lot of immigrant churches, Asian American churches, have separated out the youth group as a separate ministry. But both in Asian American churches and non-Asian American churches, we've known that in the last 20 years, the research has shown that 70% of the kids who leave youth group after they graduate youth group is because of their lack of intergenerational connections to the church, their parents not being the primary disciple makers in their families. And so, and the Bible clearly says, Deuteronomy 6, Proverbs 22, Ephesians 6, about intergenerational ministry and parents and the church not being separate from the teenagers. So it's just something that we need to really think about in our Asian American churches now, because my kids speak the same language as me.
Right.
But me as a parent am only used to separate youth group.
Right.
And so, but really the research has shown, and the Bible shows, how important it is of intergenerational relationships and the parenting role in why kids leave the church after youth group.
Yeah. I mean, I think I struggled with that a lot, especially when I first started to understand that, there's different church models out there in terms of how youth ministries are integrated into the broader church. Yeah. And because in an immigrant church context, because of language barrier, for the most part, we have that separation. But I've always felt like coming into certain spaces, like, I don't have that much to consider and talk about. In fact, maybe our model is inferior because of the ways in which we have to be separated out for cultural reasons and language reasons. Yeah. But I think the struggle for me has been, how do I dump that mindset, and how do I actively begin to engage in ways that, yes, maybe our Sunday services might be separated, but how do we as a church culture start to see youth as, basically mini adults that need to be integrated into the greater part of the church? One of the things I've said is one of the reasons why high school students, especially in Asian American churches, they leave after college and they go on to another church, or they leave the church altogether, is because they never really felt like they were a part of the church. Like the main sanctuary is not their church. That's a separate church in a lot of ways. And so I think working towards the goal of helping adult leaders and church leaders understand that we have to really be better at integrating youth into the culture of the church is super important. And so one of the things we've tried to do at our church was to really focus on how do we get youth students to volunteer alongside adults, especially in the children's ministries. And I think we've been fairly successful at doing that integration and making it feel like a place that's very welcome. And it's become another interesting place for fellowship, actually, for the youth students to be able to serve children's, but also to serve adults and serve alongside adults. And so that's been, I think, a place that's been really good for us. But I don't know, culturally it's hard. It's hard, I think, for adults in general to see their children and their friends, children
Yeah.
not necessarily as peers, but as coworkers in the gospel. So,
Yeah. I mean, in our church too, I was the youth pastor for 29 years in a Korean immigrant church somehow, but halfway through, I tried to become more family ministry and intergenerational. So we tried to do more intergenerational, bilingual worships, tried to do mission trips intergenerationally. We tried to do service like Vacation Bible School or work with the senior ministry of our church and things like that, to have our kids feel more part of the church,
Right.
the overall body of the church. And whether that means they stay at your church, long term, or they find another church, we just want to promote a healthy ecclesiology, that they are important members of the church, they are part of the body of Christ, and they're connected to the church and their families.
Yeah. A mutual friend that we know, Justin Wong,
Yeah.
he's a youth pastor in Houston. He actually has his students go through church membership.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing about that for the first time and thinking like that to me sounds pretty radical, but it's been such a discipleship growth maker for his church.
Yeah.
And it's been really cool to see that, something that they do. So I also think something that church leaders should consider if they have that sort of active like membership classes and things like that to integrate the youth into those things.
And another note on this is this idea of parents being the primary disciple makers. Probably in first generation immigrant churches that I served at, my parents didn't speak the language.
Right.
So they couldn't really do that. But as now I have kids and I speak a common language with my children, I hope our second generation, for the sake of the third generation, would take on that role of being the primary disciple makers and not outsource to the youth group. We would be much more family ministry oriented. And, Kevin, you and I were at the Gospel Coalition Conference where we had over 1,000 people at our family ministry workshop. And I say they weren't all Asians. There were not many Asians there. But I think the whole church in America is struggling with family ministry and how to do it. And so there's just a little grace to Asian American churches, but we all need to really be promoting and valuing the important role of parents in the disciple making of their own kids.
Yeah. So that brings me to my next question, which I think oftentimes church leaders and even parents believe things about youth students, their own teenagers, children's ministry as well, I think to some degree, that make it hard, I think, for us to try to promote this and to push this model. What are some of the things that have frustrated you about the things maybe parents believe in about, or even church leaders believe in about youth students and youth ministry that you've had to contend with in your years?
I mean, my wife's a psychologist, a counselor. She helps me in youth ministry and family ministry. And she has this phrase, which I stole from her, which she tells parents, be the parent. Very trite.
Yeah.
Sounds unoriginal, but it's very profound. And sometimes parents believe that their kids don't want to be discipled, their kids don't want to have family worship, kids don't want to sit down and talk about faith. And my kids, I always say I love my kids, and raising teenagers was the hardest thing I've ever done. But they were good kids too, and it was still hard. But we have to be the parent.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying you have to open up the hymnal and sing, hymns with your kids and read the 10 Commandments every night. And,
that's what my parents tried to do.
But I think our calling as parents is to be the parent. And, even if it's 15 minutes a couple times a week, to sit and talk about faith, talk about Jesus. And this stereotype that parents have that their kids are going to hate them or rebel or not study for SAT because we're trying to do a little bit of discipleship and family faith time, I think is us not being parents. Yeah.
I think, when it comes to, especially things like family devotions,
Yeah.
I think that's something that does get promoted a lot. Parents feel the need to either be like the pastor,
Yeah.
like do a full
Yeah.
service, sing the hymn, open up the Bible, explain the passage. And they're like, oh, we don't have time for this. It's a whole hour. But I think to your point, it's, parenting is very different from pastoring.
Yeah.
You don't have to do a full worship service.
Yeah.
It could just be even praying for your kids
Yeah.
a couple times a week
Yeah.
before they go to bed. Like
Yeah.
that's a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
I think the main thing for me is, in terms of that phrase, be the parent. Part of it is be needy in front of the Lord, in front of your kids.
Yeah.
I think that's huge.
Yeah.
Because I think parents sometimes, one of the lies they believe in is that if I show my vulnerability with my children, or if I show that I'm struggling with my faith, or if I show that maybe today I'm a little angry at God, if I show those things, that my students or my children will, somehow they'll get a negative perception of who God is. And then they'll run away. And so oftentimes parents don't really open up about those struggles. But I think, we have younger children, but I think one of the most powerful things in our home and the culture that we've tried to create is, my wife and I, we don't try to hide things from our kids in terms of the struggles that we go through. We in fact invite them to pray with us, and we pray with them. And I think that's part of the reason why when they struggle with stuff, so my son's now in 6th grade going to 7th grade, he has doubts. And he actually goes to a Christian school, but he has doubts. And so it was wonderful to be able to sit with him and say, hey, these are great questions. These are questions that we ask too.
That's great.
And we can talk about these things, I do think that the first generation has a fear of that.
Yeah.
As if
Or language.
Language too, for sure. But I know that when I was in high school and I was struggling with some stuff, and I'd ask my mom some things, there was definitely, I could tell this was freaking her out. So I didn't really want to do more because I didn't want to worry her, because it's that whole thing of, you don't want to burden somebody with these things that you're going through. And so I really kind of shut those conversations down in my own mind. And that's me dealing with my own stuff. But I do think that when parents recognize that it's okay to struggle together, and it's okay to come to the Lord together and need things, I actually think that's really powerful.
And when you talk about your son and him expressing his doubt and you ministering to him, we do stuff like drive our kids to school activities, take them to SAT classes, take them to school stuff all the time. And that's great. I think it's part of being a parent. But that time, more than driving them or doing something for them, your presence and time and conversation. And you talking about that, Kevin, I think is, those times can be conversational times and opportunities. Doesn't necessarily have to be at night before you sleep, or we did ours on Sunday afternoons after church and things like that. But we do so much, but are we actually present with them in doing all those things? And that's what I like to encourage parents of, is that you can do stuff for them, but are you really being present for them? And there's a great opportunity to do some discipleship and ministry and care and just talk like you did with your, middle schooler. Let them express their doubts and talk about it with them. Be vulnerable.
Okay, so that brings me to my last question. So we as longtime youth workers, one of the reasons we've been able to last so long is we had a lot of church support. But we fell in love with youth ministry and what the energy that we get from teenagers and some of the things that we see in terms of the ways that they approach the world. So I guess the last question, and we'll end the plane here. What hope does the youth offer to the church today?
Do you have any good thoughts on that?
I think there's always conversation about generational differences. And I think one of the unique things about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, the emerging generation into middle school and high school, is they really truly want authenticity in ways that I think brings out better things in leaders. So there's less of the let's pretend that everything's okay. And I think I truly appreciate that. I remember the first time I was leading a Bible study and I was walking through a passage that was talking about suffering. And I just kind of stopped and I just decided, I'm probably going to overshare a little bit, but I'm gonna share a little bit about what's going on. And it was the response from the students was so encouraging, and that was when I realized that we had a relationship.
Yeah.
Was when they saw the way that I was struggling and they offered to pray. They offered, and they had so much empathy. That's actually another trait I think about the emerging generation, is how much empathy they have.
Yeah.
But I think what that does is, I think that can help bridge generations, because we have, one of the things I strive to do is try to have as many adult volunteers as small group leaders, not just the cool college and young adults, but a lot of those parents, because they have brokenness with their parents in the first generation above them. I think they had some struggling to open up to their students, but over the years, as you develop those relationships and as you open up, there's actually so much healing that happens there.
Yeah.
So I've always said that I think Gen Z and Gen Alpha are the generation that could help heal a lot of these wounds that have been opened up in previous generations.
Yeah.
And I think that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah.
I know.
And that authenticity, I think, and you also used the term quite a bit in your last answer about the relationships. And I love that about teenagers. They, value and embrace relationships. And again, as Kevin said, not just young, hip college students, but, of older adults. One of the things we've implemented, that I got this idea from Chap Clark of Fuller Seminary, who used to serve as the youth ministry professor. The ratio in youth ministry is, for every one adult, you take care of 5 kids, like as a chaperone or a trip, mission trip or retreat or something like that. But he reversed that ratio, and he said, in your church, can you think about 5 adults for each teenager? And that is just a way of thinking about relational ministry, these authentic relationships that these teenagers are looking for, and not just from the cool hip college student, but from somebody who's older, a small group leader, maybe a different parent than their own,
Right.
And then also helping them foster a relationship with their parent, me as the youth pastor and things like that. And so I think, Kevin, what you're talking about, authenticity, and again, that leads to that makes me think of the power of relationships with these teenagers can be such an effective way of caring and loving and ministering to them. Hopeful, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Danny, so much for this conversation.
Before we finish, I just wanted to promote this new book by Rooted Ministry called The Jesus I Wish I Knew in High School, Asian American Edition, specifically written for Asian American teenagers. And Kevin was the editor on this book. Kevin, can you tell us a little bit about this book? Because I think it's going to be really great for teenagers.
It's a book that's written specifically for the teenager, but I think it's a resource for parents. I think it's something that parents and teenagers can actually read together. But it features 14 chapters, 12 distinct authors that are talking about their experiences in high school.
Do you know one of the authors?
One of the authors happens to be Danny Kwon. That's right. But yeah, these chapters are designed to help students recognize that their struggles are normal. Even for people in generations past have struggled with these things. They are all coming from a distinctly Asian American voice. We're writing in our own voice. And we're basically helping students to recognize, like, the things that you go through, you're not alone. Christ is with you. And what does it mean for you to know Jesus deeply at this stage in your life? As I was editing the book and reading the chapters, there were so many times where I just wept, knowing that this Jesus cares not just about me as a person, but me in my ethnicity, in my culture, and it was so encouraging to read that. And I cannot wait for this book to get into the hands of teenagers. Yeah.
So while it's for teenagers, parents can read it with their teenagers.
Yes.
As a youth pastor, I would buy 200 copies for my youth group and give them all to each kid and read it together with them.
Absolutely.
And so, again, this book, The Jesus I Wish I Knew in High School, Asian American Edition, it'll be out at the end of September of this year.